conscious enough to know that was a conscious act on my part, and that was essentially the reason.
To drown out that noise, for sure.
Well, they might like a little entertainment too, you know. At first, I tried to make it nice, right?
Yeah, how did you do that, Gary?
I was holding parties here for one thing. I consciously knew I was trying to hide the evidence. Nothing was working. I was trying to find something that worked that would make them shut up to stop hollering.
So I could progressive kind of infliction of pain on these women.
I was trying to find something that would make them behave.
But it was painful to them.
I hope so. You know, that's what I was trying to achieve, you know, to make them behave. They go down in the hole in the morning, board goes over the top of the hole with the sandbags and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then they stay down there till roughly about 8 at night. I dismembered the body and I you know, started burning it on the stove. If I was a torturer, why would I have waited so long to start a torture? The torture and the pains didn't start until really after January 29th. I'm sitting there, you know, trying to figure out what the hell to do, you know? What the to do, you know? I started chopping up the body.
Hey everybody, it's Derek Judd, the Cowboy Criminologist here at Cowboy Criminology. Hope everybody's had a wonderful week, and hope you're ready for another Serial Killer Saturday. Today we're talking about Philadelphia's Gary Heidnik. Last week we talked about Gerard John Schaefer. He was just an absolutely horrific serial killer. Like I said last week, we may never know the full extent of his number of victims. And it seems like with every passing year, it seems like more and more bodies that are found are being linked to him in some kind of way. So anyway, so with Gary Heidnik, there's a lot of things about him. We talked last week and said Gerard John Schaefer was very atypical. We said the same thing about Richard Cottingham. There were a lot of things about them that made them outliers as far as being serial killers. Now, Gary Heidnik is everything you'd expect a serial killer to be. He has the exact background that you would expect him to have. His mother was a hairdresser and a full-time alcoholic, and his dad was a tradesman, tool maker and die maker, but he took a lot of pride in abusing Gary and his older brother Terry. One of the things that Michael Heidnik, Gary's father, liked to do is if Gary wet the bed, he would take the sheets and he'd hang them outside the window so everybody could see that even as Gary was advancing in years, he was still wetting the bed. Michael took this as it was a sense of shame for him. And if his kids were going to embarrass him, he was going to embarrass his kids. That didn't stop the abuse. And one of the things that you look for in uresis is something where somebody wets their bed into their early to mid teens, sometimes even into their late teens. And sometimes that's the result of a medical condition or being sound sleepers or something unrelated. But it's also very common in children who are abused. And with Gary Heidnik, that was not, that was absolutely going on with him. One of the things that Michael would do when the beatings became routine or not fun, or he just thought he needed to impress upon young Gary just exactly how displeased he was, Michael would take Gary and pick him up by the ankles, and would actually hang him outside of a second floor window. And so while Gary would scream and cry, he'd listen to his dad laugh like this was all some kind of a joke. So, shocker of all shockers, Gary's mom finally decides to leave Michael, and she remarries 3 more times. Gary had black stepfathers, his last 2. But according to everything I could find, there was no animosity. There was no, as a matter of fact, it seemed like these 2 stepfathers really treated Gary and his brother Terry fairly well. And John Douglas makes an interesting point about this. The fact that Gary grew up hating his dad, and wanting nothing to do with him, but kind of finding more of a father figure in his 2 stepfathers made him more comfortable being around, even though he was white, made him more comfortable being around blacks, Puerto Ricans, Hispanics, and helped him kind of fit in with that because, he was raised by 2 black stepfathers, and that helped. So even early in Gary's life, he showed a tremendous aptitude for business and finance. At an early age, he started reading the financial section of the paper and was able to track stocks and trades and things like that. And he kept them in his head, and he did really, really well with them. Like he grasped that. He had 2 major goals in life. He wanted to become an officer in the United States military, and he wanted to be a millionaire businessman. Gary was well on his way to doing both of those things. And he certainly had the IQ for it. Matter of fact, an IQ test showed that he was over 140, which is considered super genius. So, depending on which testing system you look at, I looked at several, and they all have their own. But average IQ is between 90 and 110. So anything above that shows somebody is fairly gifted. So, 1961, Heidnik joined the military, and shortly after he got out of boot camp, didn't seem to have any issues. He goes to Fort Sam Houston in Texas, and he's trained as a corpsman. But there's a problem. See, Gary had been supplementing his income from the United States military through a loan sharking business he had. Now, I can tell you from personal experience that every outfit in the United States military has that guy who always has money and who's always willing to lend it out, usually with some pretty extreme interest. And Heidnik was no exception to that. Unfortunately, when he was transferred to Germany, the turnaround was so quick that he ended up losing about $5,000, which is the equivalent of over $50,000 in today's money. That always kind of stuck with him, and so he decided that he was going to take much better care of his money from here on out. So he's in the military for a couple of years. 1963, he's discharged after he has all these unexplained physical and emotional symptoms. He's discharged, and he's believed to have some sort of schizoaffective disorder. There was never, as far as I know, there was never really a firm diagnosis of what he actually had, or a consensus of diagnosis. When he was discharged, he had a 10% disability rating, which most veterans will tell you is fairly standard. Now, Heidnik, because of his understanding of codes, finance, and if he had a chance to make a dollar off of it, he was going to. Well, he ended up parlaying that into a 100% disability. Now, if you want to know just exactly how big a deal it is for a veteran to get a true 100% disability rating from the VA, ask a veteran, and they'll tell you that's unicorn status right there. So he gets out, he puts money away, he goes to school to try and earn a nursing degree, and he's somewhat successful in that, except his schooling is punctuated by stays in mental institutions, and it becomes harder and harder for him to focus on his studies. Now, true to form, he begins keeping company with Black, Hispanic, and Puerto Rican women and men. It's who he's most comfortable around. Uh, Interestingly enough, a lot of people have looked at the Gary Heidnik case or Jeffrey Dahmer and looked at their cases and thought that there was some sort of latent racism there. And it really had nothing to do with race for either one. Jeffrey Dahmer just had a preference for darker skinned, slightly built males. And Gary Heidnik felt more comfortable around pretty much anybody who wasn't white because of his father. So it's when you're talking about the motives of serial killer victims, you really have to understand the serial killer, and if they have victims from a particular ethnic or racial group, you have to understand why they were drawn to that group in the first place. All right. It's real easy to sit there and say, well, this is just racism. And it goes deeper than that, or you have to go deeper than that to get to the real meaning. So, but one of the things that John Douglas found out about Gary Heidnik is that most of the people he hung out with had developmental and intellectual disabilities. And we'll talk about that here towards the end. So now he's got this 100% pension from the VA, and he's got really nothing to do with his time. He's very good about watching his money, saving his money, and investing his money. So around this time, about 1971, Gary Heidnik decides, you know what, I'm going to go on a cross-country trip. Now, this impulsivity is something that a lot of serial killers share. They get an idea in their head, and all of a sudden they're going to do it. Ted Bundy's a prime example. He falls off of his ex-girlfriend Stephanie's radar for a couple of years, and then the next thing you know, or the next thing that she knows, is Ted Bundy is right back in her life, and she's like, how in the world did this happen? And so this impulsivity, Gerard John Schaefer the same way, kidnapping two girls, leaving them out in a mangrove swamp a couple hours before you have to be on duty. It's very impulsive. It's not well thought out. But somewhere in this, he gets the idea that he's going to start a church. The United Church of the Ministries of God was the church he decided to set up, and he decided to use his own home as home base. Heidnik filed all the proper IRS paperwork. He incorporated himself as a nonprofit, as a church, and received all the tax benefits that went along with that, including paying himself a salary, because what do you know, miracle of all miracles, he's the bishop of his own church. So you could look at Gary Heidnik as having sort of a messianic complex. And I don't think he's like David Koresh, even though you look at some pictures and they look eerily similar. But I think that in a way, Gary Heidnik did have a messianic complex in the fact that he believed that he was inherently more superior than everybody around him. So now, you got to keep in mind, so this is 1971, 1972, and late 60s, early 70s, there's this whole renewed age of spiritualism, of people trying to find themselves. And so new churches kind of came and went. I mean, they were there at sunrise and they were gone by sunset. And so it was very interesting. It's a very interesting time. And when you think about a lot of individuals who are trying to cling to that, you had Charles Manson out on the West Coast, trying to find some identity in spiritualism or what have you. It really doesn't. It's really based on his personality. It's not so unusual that Gary Heidnik would have founded his own church. He would have founded his own church because I don't think he wasn't strong enough to be able to follow somebody else. He had to be the main focus. So who made up his congregation? So most of his people were local from the neighborhood. A lot of them dealt with substance abuse disorders, mental health issues. And the church grew. I mean, it never got huge, but he had a small and loyal congregation. But because of his shrewd investing from 1971 to 1987, in the spring of 1987 when he was arrested, Gary Heidnik was able to amass a small fortune. 1987, his bank account had over $600,000 in it, which is a little over $1.6 million in 2024. All right, so I mean that was a lot. Most people would consider that a lot of money today. It was certainly a lot of money back then. Heidnik's trying to build his church, but he's already made himself bishop. So what's the next step in that? He has to bring in unquestioning followers. Well, so he decides that he's going to take up with a lady named Anjanette Davis, and they have a child together. Well, this wedded bliss doesn't last too long, because after the child is born, the child is almost immediately taken away by Child Protective Services. But Heidnik and Davis were undeterred, and so they went to a group home where Anjanette's developmentally disabled sister was living. They signed her out for what was supposed to be just a day trip, and they brought her back to his house, where he proceeded to rape and beat this poor woman and keep her held hostage. So Anjanette's mother and I believe an aunt came to the house because they knew who had signed Alberta out, and they were looking for her. And of course, Anjanette and Gary were like, "Oh no, we haven't seen her. We took her back. We don't know what's going on," or they made up some excuse. And unfortunately, even though she was protected, she wasn't able to live on her own. The police said that, she's a 34-year-old woman, and if she decides to leave, there's not really anything they can do, so no real investigation was done. However, once it became clear that Heidnik and Anjanette were hiding Alberta, the police were able to go in, and when they found her, she was cowering in a a storage room in the basement of the house. And, you know, who knows what all Gary Heidnik did to her. But he was charged with kidnapping, rape, endangerment, and unlawful restraint. Now, this is interesting. So, the psychological profile that was created, or this is more of a report than a profile, but John Douglas makes an interesting connection here, and I want you all to think about this, because this fits most of your sexually sadistic offenders. Extremely insecure and confused. Long history of mental illness. Now, mental illness can be anything you think about, but it could also be signs of borderline personality, antisocial personality. You might know those as psychopathic or sociopathic personalities. People know there's something off with them. All right. Psychosexually immature. Now, remember, we talked about with Gerard John Schaefer, and I said in that last video that sexual sadists often seek out relationships with people younger than them. There's an age gap, usually more than 6 years, because they are trying to they want to keep the individual submissive to them, and they want to have that perceived age, experience, wisdom, whatever it is. But the thing about that is that even though they are chronologically older, they're not as emotionally or mentally mature. Okay. And because of that, they tend to seek out people who have developmental disorders, emotional disorders, things like that. Easily threatened by women who could be equal to his intellectuality or emotionality, cannot take criticism, needs constant validation and reassurance of his superiority, manipulative, impulsive, lacking good judgment, prey on those he views as weak or dependent. Okay. Sounds like we made a really good case for just about every serial killer on the planet, really. So, under Pennsylvania law, Philadelphia is not a state. Under Pennsylvania law, the judge was only able to sentence him to between 4 and 7 years, and he's out in 4 years and some change. He was released on April 1983 on parole. Now, if you're expecting me to, do my regular rant about people being afforded bail or parole or probation when it's inappropriate, go ahead and see another video. But just another example of people who went out on parole and committed more crimes. Okay. So 1984, he buys another home, and he has a child out of wedlock with a local woman in the neighborhood. And there's not a whole lot about what happened to that woman or the son, obviously because of the nature of what he was arrested for. I'd imagine any woman with half a brain in her head would want to put significant distance in between the two of them. But Heidnik decides he wants to be married. He thinks that if he could find the right woman, he could settle down, he could start raising a family, he can really focus. So he enlists the help of a bridal service out of the Philippines. This is where race might have played something into it, because according to him, in his mind, he believed that Asian women were naturally brought up to be subservient to their husband, and he wouldn't have to wine and dine. He wouldn't have to be brutal. He wouldn't have to. He'd be able to curb a lot of his natural desires. So he ends up with a woman, 22-year-old Betty Disto, and they're married in 1985. About a week later, week after getting married, Betty comes home and she finds Gary Heidnik in bed with 3 women. And Betty knows that this is not natural, even though Gary's like, no, 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 this is just how we do things here in the United States, and this is the prerogative of the head of household, of the man, and you just have to accept that. And Betty didn't. Betty was not having any of that. So she confides in Gary that, hey, this isn't working. You're not who you said you were, and I'm wanting to leave. Heidnik decides, okay, well, if you're going to leave me, then obviously the only way to keep women in line these days is with threat of violence and actual violence. And so he threatened that he was going to kill her if she ever left him. So she finally gets up the courage, and incredibly brave of her, and so fortunate for her. She says, you know what? I'm out of here. And enlisting the help of some other Filipino expatriates that happened to live in the area, she was able to get away. Now, in September of 1986, she lets Gary know, hey, we had a kid, and pretty much disappears from his life until just before his execution, when Betty and Gary Heidnik's daughter got together pleading for clemency, saying that he wasn't mentally fit to be executed. So that's kind of interesting. So Thanksgiving 1986, Gary Heidnik has decided, you know what? I've done everything I can to try and build up my church, to try and build up my family, to try and do all of these different things. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build a church. I'm going to build a church family. And his idea is he was going to acquire 10 wives, and each of them would birth him 1 child each, for starters. And he thought that was a very, very promising way to not only build his family, but to build his church, and also have people that were completely dependent, not devoted, but dependent on him. So he's driving around and he comes across Josefina Rivera, a 25-year-old part-time prostitute. He pulls up, picks her up. They agree to go and have sex for $20, I think it was. Josefina broke her cardinal rule. According to Josefina, the one time she actually agreed to go back to a client's home and have sex is when she ran into one of the most sexually sadistic offenders in the annals of true crime. They go back to his house. They go upstairs. They, things proceed. After everything's done, she decides, okay, well, I'm gonna start getting dressed. And as she's trying to get dressed, Gary Heidnik comes up behind her and immediately begins to strangle her. She starts blacking out. And in one of the interviews I saw of her, she was talking about how it felt like it was flashes from like a projected movie, and she was just seeing clips of her life just kind of flashing before her eyes. When she comes to, she finds herself in the basement, and Gary Heidnik is standing over, and he's taken a radiator hose clamp, and he's put it on her ankle, and he's taken some super glue, and after he's tightened down the nut to secure the clamp, he had super glue to make sure that it can't be undone. As if that's not bad enough, she looks down and she realizes that threaded through the radiator hose clamp is a chain that's attached to the wall. And she realizes that she has very limited mobility here in this basement. The basement is super, super, super creepy because inexplicably, in the darkness, in the damp, in the murk, is a large pit dug through the concrete, large enough to hold several bodies. And so things are looking very, very bleak for her. She tried a couple of times to escape. She was drugged back by her ankle back into the basement. She was raped. She was beaten. She was tortured. Her escape attempts actually led Gary Heidnik to break up the windows around the basement, and also he started adding insulation to help kind of soundproof the basement. About a week goes by, and Heidnik captures 24-year-old Sandra Lindsay. His third victim was 19-year-old Lisa Thomas. He abducted her 2 days before Christmas, 1986. January 2nd, 1987, he abducts Deborah Dudley, age 23. January 18th, 1987, he kidnaps Jacqueline Askins. His final kidnapping occurred on March 23rd, 1987, with 25-year-old Agnes Adams. Now, interestingly enough, Josefina Rivera had become something of a confidant to Gary Heidnik. And I don't know if he just took to her or she displayed some type of behavior that drew Heidnik to her, but she ended up with a lot more privileges, if you want to call them that. I feel creepy. In the context, I feel creepy using that word. But I don't know a better way to say it. But Josefina Rivera actually helped with the kidnapping of Adams. And so things back in the dungeon, for lack of a better word, or calling it like it is, whichever you prefer. Deborah Dudley seemed to be, and I'm not saying that out of the 6 women that were kidnapped, 4 of them survived. And I am not saying that Deborah Dudley was any better, but I think she was stronger and a better challenge for Gary Heidnik on an emotional level, on an intellectual level, because apparently those two were constantly butting heads. And so Gary Heidnik would often beat her with a stick. He would torture her. He'd starve her. He'd do all these things. He'd try to get the women to turn on each other, get them to say they were trying to escape or they said something bad, whatever it was. And he would use that as an excuse. Well, if the women decided to clam up, he'd just beat the one that he asked. And so it was literally a lose-lose situation. But like a lot of sexual offenders, or like a lot of sadistic offenders, they will keep their captives on their toes by offering like special meals, because we'll get to that here in a second. They will offer captives more freedom for their compliance, I guess is a good way to say that. But everything that Gary Heidnik does, it comes down to this. He's trying to impress his superiority over these women. And that's the concept he was trying to get them to grasp. So now remember, he's trying to start a family. These are his wives, okay? And sorry. These are his wives. So he's monitoring their menstrual cycles. He's checking them for signs of fertility. But he's also worried because people keep looking for these missing women at his house. And in order to keep the women from being heard, he starts trying to soundproof the basement, but he can only do so much. So what does he do? Turns up the volume on the TV, turns up the volume on the radio. Now, interestingly enough, you heard him say that the radio and the television were not only to drown out the sound, but for their entertainment. I'm not a total monster. I mean, come on. I have a heart somewhere. I mean, yeah, he was interviews with sexually sadistic serial killers. In a lot of ways, they're really surprising because the way that they rationalize, neutralize, and justify their actions, it just defies logic. And you just have to sit there and you almost shake your head because you're just like, wow, you actually believe all of that nonsense coming out of your mouth. So Gary Heidnik has 6 women that he's trying to take care of, but they're not trained, they're not broken in, they're not submissive enough for him yet. So he feeds them the cheapest way he knows how. And he starts giving them dog food. And it's if that's not just the ultimate, if you had any doubt in your mind that you belong to me, let that go away right now, because this is proof right here. This is what I think you're worth. This is why you eat dog food and I eat whatever I want. So unfortunately, the television, the radio starts creating a problem because the neighbors are like, that radio, that television is blaring at all hours of the night. Police come over, talk to Gary Heidnik about it, and he's like, okay. So, trying to remember which one of his victims it was. Jacqueline Askins stated that Gary Heidnik had actually pushed screwdrivers into their ears and punctured their eardrums. Doing that because if you ever plug your ears and you try to talk, it sounds really loud in your head, but your voice is coming out really soft. And that also prevented the women from knowing when Gary was walking around upstairs, when he left the house, if somebody had come to the house, was looking for them. So it's hard to sexual sadists who take multiple victims together or keep multiple victims together are frightening, because the amount of control that they get and that they can play off of their victims, off of each other, it's terrifying. And I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a mental health professional. But I do have enough mental health training to really question whether a full psychological recovery is ever possible. The sheer amount of PTSD and just thinking about anything that could set these women off. I mean, you just have to wonder. So, Sandra Lindsay, she dies of starvation, torture, and an untreated high-grade fever. Uh, according to Jacqueline Askins, she testified that Gary Heidnik took her up into the kitchen of the main house along with Sandra's corpse, and he had her help him dismember Sandra's body. Now, there's a popular thing happens here that says that Gary Heidnik took the flesh from Sandra's body, ground it up, and added it to the dog food and fed it not only to his dogs, but fed it to his captives too. According to his attorney, Charles Peruto, he says that Heidnik just made that up. It was something for the press. It was something to kind of add to his mystique. And while there's no doubt her body was dismembered, the cannibalism aspect of it is greatly up for debate. There was no evidence found for that. So after Sandra's body is dismembered, neighbors start complaining of a foul odor coming from the house. Yeah, I know. So, new officer shows up, questions Heidnik about it, and this officer must have had about as much experience in the kitchen as he did as a police officer, because Heidnik's like, "Oh, I burned my dinner, and that's what they're smelling, and I'm sorry, and it should clear out. I guess I'm not a really good cook." And the young officer's like, "Oh, well, okay." So, I'm going to explain something to you. You've heard it on every true crime detective show you've ever watched. Decomposing human flesh has a very, very distinct smell. And when you think about this, let's see, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Anthony Sowell, they all, before they were caught, had calls going to their house about a wretched, putrid smell coming from the house. And I can tell you this, that as an officer, whenever I got called about an unusual smell, I'd always ask the dispatcher, if they still had the caller on the phone, "Hey, can you have them describe the smell?" And I was never so relieved to find out that the smell was like a gas leak, or um, uh, somebody had dropped a load of trash going to the dump, and a nasty bag of something had fallen out, and they didn't know it was back there, something like that. But those unusual smells, especially if I heard words like putrid or rotten, I'd always get this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I always readied myself, because I was always like, "All right, this is the call. This is the call. I knew it was coming." And fortunately, that wasn't the case. But I don't know of a way where you could ethically expose police recruits to the smell of decaying human flesh. But I do think it's important, especially for new officers, that they, if they have the chance to be exposed to that smell, they do get exposed to that smell, because the first time you smell it, it stays with you. You may forget how to tell time, may forget how to tell your shoes, you may forget who your spouse is, you may forget who your kids are, but you will know that smell to the day you die. No pun intended. So, March 19th, 1987, Deborah Dudley and Gary Heidnik come to a head. She's insolent. She's he believes that he's getting, or Deborah's getting the other victims to rally, the other 5 down there, and they're getting ready, or 4 at this time, and they're getting ready to revolt against him, and he can't have that. He's got to have order. He's got to have discipline. So when the beatings aren't enough, and when the starvation isn't enough, puts Deborah down in the pit, along with I cannot believe I'm having such a hard time with her name today. With Jacqueline Askins. Puts them both down in the hole and has Josephina Rivera begin filling the hole with water. In doing this, Gary Heidnik had come up with an interesting way to torture his victims, and he would plug in a wire to an electrical outlet, and he'd cut the wire on the other end, leaving the wire exposed, and he would stick the wire down into the water of the pit, and he would electrocute his victims. Well, he's enjoying what's going on, because part of the psychopathology of the sexual sadist is enjoying watching the fear, the humiliation, the pain that's being inflicted on their victim. He was not paying attention to what he was doing, and the wire ended up touching the chain on Deborah's leg. It electrocuted her and killed her. So obviously that ends the fun for him. Proof that he's a sexual sadist is that once the bodies were dead, he no longer had any use for them. And I told you in the Gerard John Schaefer video, that's the difference between sexual sadists that engage in necrophilia and sexual sadists that once the body gives up, once there's no more life in the body, they have no more use. And Gary Heidnik's a prime example of that. So he starts freaking out, and he writes out a confession and gets Josephina Rivera to sign it. Because if for whatever reason Josephina decided to flip on him, he could always say, well, she was in on it, she participated, she totally agreed with it, and so mutually assured destruction. But now he's down to 2 victims. I'm sorry, he's down to, you got Josephina, Ames. Okay, so Sandra Lindsay's dead. Lisa Thomas, Jacqueline Askins are still there, along with Josephina Rivera. Okay, so three of the original 5 are still alive. So for whatever reason, Josephina has found some type of favor with Gary Heidnik, and she's like, hey, it's been a long time. I need to go. I need to talk to my family. I need to let them know I'm okay, so they quit coming around looking for me. And he's like, okay. And he's like, so do me this one favor. We're going to go bring another girl back. So she helps him kidnap another victim, and bring her back to the house. This woman, if you want to say that she's lucky, she was only in captivity for less than a day. But Josephina originally, once she said goodbye to Gary at the gas station, said, hey, I'll be back, whatever, and he was going to wait for her. She runs to an old boyfriend, and she bangs on the door. He opens the door, like, what are you doing here? She explains, hey, I was abducted. I've been held captive in this house, and he's done all these things. And her ex-boyfriend turns her away because everything that's coming out of her mouth sounds like some kind of drug-addled delusion to try and explain why she took up with another man or why she up and left, one thing or another. But he ends up putting her out. So now Josephina is left with the decision. She can go back to her family, who may or may not take her story seriously like her boyfriend did, or she can be brave and she can put an end to this. And the amount of bravery that Josephina showed is nearly unparalleled in true crime. She goes and she calls the police. The police get in touch with her. They listen to her story. They see the chafing on her ankle. She's able to describe things in great detail, including missing persons. And so the police automatically say, okay, we're going to get a warrant and we're going to go search the house. So they go and they rescue Agnes Adams, they rescue Lisa Thomas, and they rescue I don't know why I'm having such a hard time with her name. And they rescue Jacqueline Askins. I'm just having the hardest time remembering her name. That's why you make notes. And so they rescue these four women are rescued. And when the police start to hear all of the things that are being told to them, they cannot believe the torture that these women were, that was inflicted on these women. So I've compared Heidnik to Ted Bundy and Ariel Castro, and a behavior of this type of offender is when they're caught, when the game's up, they decide, because it's all about them, they're superior. They're not going to let anybody get over on them. Gary Heidnik tries to hang himself in April of 1987, shortly after his arrest. Quick-acting correctional officers cut him down, get him the treatment that he needs, and he's able to stand trial. Ariel Castro would end up hanging himself after he was convicted, and I know how this sounds, so whatever the best way to take this is, take it that way. But doesn't it seem just a little problematic in your logical thinking to say, I'm not going to die in a prison cell, only to hang yourself in a prison cell? I'm not going to spend the rest of my life in prison, so I'm going to take my life in a prison cell. I don't know how to think about that. I think that'd be a great question to drop in a philosophy class and then turn around and walk away, because you know the fur's going to fly there. Interestingly enough, Heidnik, even with all of his mental health issues, and I think the hardest concept I have explaining to people about organized and disorganized offenders is that a highly organized offender will never be found insane. Their behavior is depraved. It shocks the conscience. It torture, sexual assault, you name it. But that doesn't make them insane. As a matter of fact, the thing that just kind of impresses me about this whole case is, just like Al Capone was taken down for tax evasion, like the litany of crimes that he committed, he was taken down for tax evasion. But it was actually Gary Heidnik's investing prowess that showed that he was incredibly sane and capable of understanding very complicated, very sophisticated financial and trading information, tax codes, and things like that in order to hide his investments and build his wealth. So, July 6th, 1999, after being denied clemency or being denied a stay on July 3rd, he was sentenced to die by lethal injection on July 6, 1999. He was the last inmate executed in the state of Philadelphia, in the state of Pennsylvania. Having all kinds of issues today. Words, names, states, not my friend today. And I don't know what's going on with that. But I would be hard-pressed to think of an offender who deserved the death penalty more. His crimes were absolutely horrific. And next week, I'd like to do a special video where I talk to y'all about who I think the scariest serial killer, fictional serial killer, is throughout cinematic history. And I've narrowed it down to two. There's a list that you can look at that's out now. And I kind of disagree with it, but we'll get into more of that later. Y'all, thank you so much for joining me here at Cowboy Criminology on another episode of Serial Killer Saturdays. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope y'all have a great weekend. Stay safe.